Scano swagwego, dea wanda tenya kia song otahioni, ne wagi shot dan ganyak kiono ni wakwenzadan, oswego nun dage. Good morning. I bring greetings of peace and good health from my people in, we call it the Great Lakes area of North America. To give you a quick geography lesson, in terms of where my people come from, we're from the eastern Great Lakes area around Lake Ontario. We straddle what's now called the US-Canada border, but it is all Ganonshunige. It's our territory on both sides of that artificial border. And I come from the Mohawk Nation and the Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And our people have been in this part of the world since the beginning of time, as we understand it. When exactly that falls into the Gregorian calendar doesn't really matter to us. We know we were there before anybody else. So I also want to acknowledge particularly Uncle Chegg and Auntie Charmaine for their beautiful greetings to us and to all of the people of this land and to all the people who call this home. It's lovely to get to visit this territory, if only for a brief amount of time. I will be back. It is truly a lovely place, and I'm thankful for that opportunity. I also want to acknowledge particularly the amazing people at the University of Queensland who are just lovely. I wish I could borrow some of you. Maybe we'll work out something later. Don't tell Bronwyn. Although we could borrow her too. And then, of course, as well, the Australian Academy for the Humanities. It's really wonderful to get this chance to gather with such brilliant minds. There's not a lot of us here, but there's a lot of brilliance, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity. I also want to preface what I'm going to say today by mentioning that I am not a Canadian, although I am a scholar of Canadian Indigenous policy and history. It's not really by choice that I ended up studying Canadian Indigenous policy and history. It kind of chose me in terms of people who decided to settle amongst us. I also want to be clear that while I travel on a US passport, I am not either an American. I am a citizen of the Haudenosaunee. Our people have existed for millennia in our territories, and that's been documented for hundreds of years in our own records, in the records of other Indigenous peoples, and for the last 400 or so years in the records of European visitors who still haven't found their way back home. And before, I wanted to preface this in terms of talking a bit about how I landed into this work of being an Indigenous Studies scholar. Before returning to graduate school to do my PhD in 2000, I lived and worked in Buffalo, New York, which is part of the traditional territory of the Seneca Nation, which is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I regularly traveled back and forth to Six Nations across our traditional territories, from the areas west of Buffalo and Niagara Falls. To give some reference points, it's roughly a 60-mile trek, or about 100 kilometers. It takes about 90 minutes to make the drive, and I often contemplated, how did I become a landless Mohawk in the midst of Ganonshunige? And that inspired me to take up those questions in my doctoral studies. It's also highly relevant for me to situate myself within the profession of Indigenous Studies and the university where I currently work. These are some of my awesome colleagues in the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. So I did my PhD in the Native Studies department at Trent University. They changed the name to Indigenous Studies a couple years after I graduated. Trent was the second such PhD program in North America and the first in Canada. And I was in the second cohort of their PhD program. In Canada today, there are 4 universities that offer PhDs in Indigenous Studies. Trent, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And then there are some other programs at other institutions like Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria. But it's particular to governance. So you're not going to get anybody doing artistic expression in iGov, although they do get pretty loose with their rules around governance. And so my department at the University of Toronto has been in existence for nearly 30 years, but only achieved departmental status last year. And the biggest change that comes with becoming a department at the University of Toronto is that you get to hold primary faculty appointments. Prior to last year, every one of us who was appointed in the department, well, in the program, had a primary appointment in a different unit. So for example, my primary appointment was in the Department of History. And there was something similar for all of my colleagues. We were in religion, political science, geography and planning, and linguistics primarily. As of this year, we have 10 full-time continuing lines in Indigenous Studies, and of those, 7 have primary appointments in Indigenous Studies now. We have 1 full-time limited term position, which is being converted to a tenure stream position next year. And we have 1 additional full-time teaching stream position that's currently being searched. And when that search is complete, we will have 3 full-time Indigenous language professors who teach Indigenous languages. And I do commend the University of Toronto for this commitment to Indigenous language revitalization. I believe we have more Indigenous language professors than any other institution in Canada and possibly in all of North America. And they're all fluent speakers in their respective languages. We also have 4 75% lecturer lines. We remain, however, an undergraduate-only program. And we are starting the process to build a graduate program that will offer both MAs and PhDs. And we anticipate a program launch in 2025 with a fall 2026 intake. So just to give you this background of where I'm coming from, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just trying to talk about myself, because I'm just trying to help it make sense in terms of what I'm going to share. So in comparison to other Canadian universities, particularly those to the west, UofT was late to the game for building a viable Indigenous Studies program that offered a major in particular. There are other schools that were offering minors or certificates, but we were definitely late to the game in this. This is also true of our strongest competitor institution, which is McGill University in Montreal. So we're considered the 2 most highly ranked institutions in Canada. We're also both schools overly obsessed with rankings. But also the irony is not lost on those of us who work in Indigenous Studies that despite all of their accolades and self-accolades, they were so late to coming to the table in terms of Indigenous Studies. I'm a little bit happy to say that we're at least ahead of McGill, but neither one of us has a whole lot to be all that proud about in terms of particularly that recognition and acceptance of Indigenous Studies as a valid and viable and important field of study. And so there's a lot of work to do. And that's certainly the agenda that I took up when I joined the university in 2017. So as a department head and an academic leader, I work from the premise that Indigenous Studies scholars have a responsibility to help Indigenous communities understand the systems that affect them, that affect us. And we do this by taking up whatever tools necessary to get the job done. And for those of us who work in well-resourced institutions, we have an additional responsibility to leverage those resources to support community-driven priorities and initiatives. For me, that has meant serving on committees across our university, including searches on all 3 of our campuses, tenure reviews inside and outside the Faculty of Arts and Science, PhD committees in at least 5 different departments, and for 3 years as a special advisor to the provost on Indigenous curriculum and education. I am not an Indigenous education specialist, but I got to be the advisor. So there was a lot of learning to do. And I spend far too much time in meetings, and I think probably many of you in the room can relate to that. In reference to getting the job done, for those of us working in Canadian universities, and I'd suggest most universities in British settler states, much of that work connects to the project of reconciliation. Again, not necessarily our choosing, most likely not our word. In Canada, in my experience, it's a project fueled heavily by settler desire. Canadians really love to be sorry. And reconciliation with Indigenous peoples has become the contemporary flagship for their sorrow. It can be exhausting, but it does present us with many opportunities. I know Brendan knows a lot about Canadian sorrow and how to leverage it. So when I first heard the term reconciliation talked about in this Canadian context, in the first year of my doctoral studies, I was excited. I took high school accounting, and I knew that reconciling was making sure the numbers add up and nothing was forgotten. As I come from a community that has articulated land claims against the Crown since 1787, including a huge financial claim, currently somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion with simple interest. These funds these were about funds governed by the Imperial Indian Department and later the Department of Indian Affairs. I thought they were going to look at the books and reconcile the funds that they had misappropriated and or mismanaged for over 200 years. I might not be landless after all. But alas, the focus of this reconciliation was not really about the books. I spent the rest of that year trying to understand this very different idea of reconciling that didn't seem to be much about money. I was told it was about relationships. Okay, they must be talking about the treaties then. And this was, and the honor of the Crown. Wrong again. It mostly seems to be about talking, and sometimes opportunities arise for doing. And while I admit I do participate in the talking, I continue to believe we cannot get there without a financial accounting. And I remind the powers that be, and whatever powers they are, of that fact at every opportunity, particularly in light of the massive economic, educational, and health disparities that continue to plague Indigenous communities in Canada, which of course is amongst one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It's important to recognize in my critique of reconciliation, however, that the early calls for reconciliation did come from Indigenous leaders. And particularly they came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that conducted its work in the early 1990s, concluded their final report in 1996. However, there was never an attempt by that body or related bodies to build consensus across Indigenous communities and nations about what reconciliation meant for us in a collective way. So the specific brand of Canadian reconciliation that gets cemented out of first RCAP and then in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools is a very vague brand, to say the least. And as an Indigenous Studies historian, I feel compelled to offer some information on the trajectory of the TRC. Just real quick, we have the Oka crisis in 1990, which occurred in and around the territory of another Haudenosaunee community, one of whom my father's matrilineal line is descended from. The name that I carry comes from my great-grandmother from that community. And so if you don't know about it, look it up. I think lots of people in the room weren't born yet when this happened. Still a little mind-blowing for me. But what came out of this crisis, which was the Canadian military was called in against their own people. And so the Royal Commission gets born out of this crisis. At the same time, there was a growing grassroots residential school survivors movement. That doesn't often get talked about a lot, but I feel it's really important to recognize this, and that survivors were pushing the agenda. And they were doing it first through healing groups within their own communities, and then eventually through lawsuits that they chose to take up against the churches and other government entities who created these schools where they incurred massive amounts of abuse. Along with that came a call for Truth Commission, both out of the residential schools movement as well as the Royal Commission. And the TRC was officially established in 2008. It didn't really get moving though until around 2011. And it was officially charted out of and funded through the Indian Residential School Settlement Act. That also was the impetus for the apology that came from the federal government to Indigenous peoples in Canada. The final report to the TRC, after years of research and community consultations and visits, was issued in 2015. And the institutional responses, the university responses to the TRC first started in November of 2015. So the university presidents were very quick to pick this up and to run with it. I just wanted to share this photo. A lot has happened, particularly in the last 2 years, around reconciliation related to the discovery of unmarked graves at a number of former residential school sites. In fact, Canada Day has been kind of taken over in a lot of places. And this is the marquee at the Byward Cinema in Ottawa, where they're calling to spend Canada Day working on the 94 calls to action. So in thinking about this idea that I'm putting forward about reconciliation being about settler desire, and I'm not a scholar that does the desire studies thing. I can give you lots of folks to check out if you want to do that. But I think it is important to classify it this way, is when we think about reconciliation, whose terms are we using? And what do we mean? Because they're not defining it for us, even though they are. So we need to define it for ourselves, and we need to be clear and consistent in how we're using it and what we're expecting to come out of it. So when I was getting hounded by my publisher to finish my book that came out of my dissertation, so honestly, the text was 90% done in 2005. I didn't get around to finishing it because they wanted this conclusion about a land claim action that happened in my community starting in 2006. I just couldn't do it. The emotion for it was too much. So my editor says, well, write something about reconciliation. And I was like, okay. So I set about having some conversations, particularly with language speakers, because I said, if I'm going to talk about reconciliation, I need to do it from within our own way of seeing the world. And I particularly sat down with my friend Ganadawakon Kent, who was a Mohawk language professor at the University of Western Ontario, where I worked at the time. And he and I talked about what we were seeing around reconciliation and what we thought it should be on our terms. And he came up with this phrase for me, and it's talking about us taking control of our own matters, again, the way that we do things. And that made a lot of sense to me because it works within an Ongohoe Neha view of the world. How do we talk about these things? Because we don't have a word for reconciliation. You know, we have words for don't be dumb. We have words for do the right thing, but not reconciliation. So I use this phrase in my book, and I use it with my students when we talk about the TRC, when we talk about all of these settler desires for reconciliation, that they really don't know what it is either. They just want to feel better. And as I mentioned earlier, the university presidents all met in 2015. They were excited to have something to put their names on. And so they did this, and then set about basically calling on their Indigenous faculty and staff to tell them how to do it. Interestingly enough, at Western, they weren't overly obsessed with it. So I didn't really understand what was happening until I went to the University of Toronto in 2017 and got handed this report. And I was like, oh, you are paying attention. And so I've had to learn a lot in a short amount of time. So I shared here just a couple of points. First is that there are 4 calls to action out of the 94 that speak about post-secondary education. And 2 of them really there's only 2 that really speak to universities, and 1 even not fully, because it's talking about the government giving us money to do this educating. But these are the 2 points of the calls to action that directly pertain to the work that universities should be doing based on the recommendations of the TRC Commission. And I shared just 2 examples here. So McGill created a committee, and interestingly enough, they used the term Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Education, even though they didn't have an Indigenous Studies department. They had a very small program with, I think, 1 tenure track person and a bunch of sessionals. And that's Alan Downey, who, as you might imagine, fled and is now at McMaster University. I mean, he helped do the work, but, and then at UofT, what came forward out of the calls to action that the committee at the university put forward was one of the biggest provisions of it is that every division of the university is expected to report annually about their progress on matters of reconciliation. Now, of course, none of them know what that actually means. I will say in my faculty, the Faculty of Arts and Science, they work hard at actually trying to work through what that means. And they put forward their own calls to action. So we have all of these crazy reports that we all try to keep track of. Well, that some of us try to keep track of. So just setting the stage for that. And obviously, in my title for today, I wanted to talk about how we navigate all of this in our own canoes. And so I'm coming from a very Haudenosaunee way of looking at the world. I know this doesn't fit for everyone. Some of y'all are desert people. And so canoes probably don't make a whole lot of sense for you. I apologize for that. But in our world, this is how one gets around. Thankfully not today, because I'm not really a good paddler. But metaphorically, this is how the world works for us. And really, it's about our own vehicles, right? And that we decide what they are and how they function and where they go. And so, obviously, I think I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know. Everybody thinks they know what Indigenous Studies is and what it does. And 95% of them don't. Sometimes including people who are in Indigenous Studies units. And so there's that work that always has to be done and redone in terms of making sure that your people are on the same page. And that doesn't mean you don't have diversity of opinions within that, but it means that you understand collectively what your work is and how you're moving forward with that. And then the other piece of this that I find valuable and important is about leveraging the opportunities that come about as a result of the goals that you set and the things that drive why you exist and what you want to achieve. And particularly for me, and I think probably for most people in the room, this is talking about community projects. It's talking about program development, because let's face it, we want to make sure we are around under the next president and the next provost and whatever it is, right? And a key piece of that is about tenure and promotion. So that's why I serve on lots of tenure committees, and I'm betting lots of you do too. And holding ourselves and others accountable. So it can, and I have to say, like, it's very bizarre for me to be at this really rich university. It's certainly, I come from a place definitely of poverty. So it's bizarre to me when I see what gets spent on like a lunch. Like, it's kind of like offensive at times, to be honest. But it's easy to get allured by that and sort of lose your path with those kinds of things. And so it's important to hold ourselves accountable. And as we do that, to hold those around us accountable. And I don't just mean within our units, I'm talking about our deans, our provosts, our vice deans, and our presidents. And I know, again, I'm fortunate. I have tenure. I'm at a well-resourced institution, I can have those conversations. Like, I didn't expect it, but at the NASA conference in May, my president said I was a badass. I've never heard him swear in my 6 years working there. I don't think anybody else in the room had heard him use that kind of candor in a public setting before. But you know what? You do what you do, right? You take advantage of those opportunities when you have them, and that's definitely going in the promotion file. But it's also about leveraging those other avenues that we have for accountability within our institutions. And I think particularly about our ethics boards. And God, I hate serving on our REB, but somebody has to do it. And the reality is, well, we have a lot of folks, you saw that photo, very few of us have tenure. And it really needs to be tenured people serving on those kinds of committees. So I do it very begrudgingly. But what I'm seeing increasingly is that a lot of my colleagues who consider themselves Indigenous Studies minded are not necessarily being compliant with the expectations our communities put on us around ethics. Also, I'm finding increasingly people who think, oh, I'm doing work in Africa, so I don't have to follow the Canadian regulations about working with Indigenous peoples. And our REB office says, well, you know what, you're right. And I say, no, you're not. and I call them out on it because it has to happen, right? Like, you know, and it's funny because sometimes we're doing it in the name of things like time and environmental respect. So for example, I had this proposal to review for a project in Africa where they were going to make the results available through an open source document. And I was like, well, and this person was an Indigenous person from Africa. I'm like, you know that open source documents are not open source documents in all parts of the world. And you know that lots of people lack the access to technology. And some people just want the paper. And you know what? Ask them. If they say, no, I don't need the paper, then that's okay. But they should have the right to make that call, not us, right? It's just an example, but that's also that part about holding ourselves accountable, right? And as well, along with this, is about helping our universities understand what reconciliation should look like, and particularly walking the talk. So in Canada and growing, like increasingly in the States, many of our institutions have our land acknowledgements that they embrace, and it really makes them feel so happy to have that. And so that becomes an opportunity to help them understand what it actually means. These aren't just pretty words on a paper. It's not just a nice picture you put up or a flag. This actually means that you walk your talk. Unfortunately, I've had a couple opportunities to push this particular agenda. So you may know that September 30th is now Canada's National Day for Reconciliation. I guess one day a year is all they really need. But there was a lot of debate about the marking of a national holiday, and it's not really a holiday either. Nobody gets the day off of work, because you know that's what a real holiday is in Canada. So there was debate, and it actually took them a year longer than they anticipated. So in 2019, the University of Toronto was waiting to hear if the federal government was going to declare it a holiday or not, and they decided, well, we're just going to do something anyway. And so they asked a group of us what they ought to do, because they didn't know. And I said, well, reconciliation should be about reconciling the original relationship. I said, that's our treaty relationship. A symbol of what that should be is a tree of peace. And so we worked with a friend of mine whose father had actually traveled the world planting trees of peace. And for us, that's a white pine. His father was the late Jake Swamp, Chief Jake Swamp. My friend is Skahandoane Swamp, who's a professor at Trent. And Doane and his family came and planted a tree. And, you know, of course, the university had to be a fancy ado. I got to sit between the chancellor and the president. And the president was like, oh, you must be nervous. And I'm like, no. I'm like, you should be. But I didn't say that. I thought it, but and in the way the university works, we just got a sign for the tree this spring. So it only took them 4 years to get a sign, but we have it. But the tree is flourishing. It's doing really well. And it's just up the road from the house where John A. Macdonald lived. And John A. Macdonald was Canada's first prime minister. We have a house that he lived in on our university property. It's where our PhDs get to defend their dissertations, which is awful. But it's just up the street. And it's in a residence area named for Daniel Wilson, who was a colleague of McDonald's. So I think it's really fitting and appropriate that we're taking space back. And then most recently, I had the opportunity, and I will admit, the University of Waterloo, which is on the Grand River, about 50 miles from where I live, issued a statement that they were going to give free tuition to community members from Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit, which is a Mississauga Anishinaabe community situated on our territory at Six Nations. They were going to give free tuition to all of their students from these two communities. At the University of Waterloo, that's about 5 people. But hey, it's something. And it also means that they're actually acknowledging the land that they're built on is land that belongs to somebody else. So I called up the provost and I said, Cheryl, what are we going to do? And the president at Waterloo is our former VP of research. I said, you heard what Vivek did? And she said, oh, yes. I said, so what are we going to do, Cheryl? And she says, well, you know, we're really torn. We want to do something. Of course, we want to do something, but we don't know how much it will affect the bottom line for students. And I said, in the end, it honestly won't affect a lot of students' bottom lines if they're already funded by their communities. Because through a federal grant, we're able to pay for the tuition for students who get funded from our communities. And then they also get a living allowance, depending upon a lot of different factors. I said, so it won't really affect their pocketbook, but it's a signal to the communities that you're actually walking your talk. And in some cases, students are self-funded, and it will make a big difference for them, to the tune of, if you're in an undergraduate program, we're talking about a little over $6,000 a year. If you're in medical school, it's more like about $18,000 or $20,000 a year. And if you're in law school, it's close to $30,000 a year. It was like, that's a signal that actually you're going to recognize that what you say is that you operate on our land, and that as a result, you're going to let us go to school on our own land without having to pay you to do that. And so they just announced this last week. So I know I'm way over time. I'm just going to end with this because, as I said, Saturday is our National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. They co-opted a grassroots holiday that had already been started by survivors. They call it Orange Shirt Day, and it's in honor of a woman who was a survivor who had to give up her orange shirt when she got taken to residential school. Her grandma had bought her this new shirt. They took it away from her at residential school. And so her story got turned into this grassroots activism, recognizing survivors, that's now been co-opted by Trudeau, because, you know, he just likes to have a party. But I wanted to share the survivors flag because, yeah, that's what's happening this week. Grassroots survivors are carrying forward this agenda with or without the federal government. So, now for your time.
All right, so I'm, this paper I gave at WIPC last year. For those who were there, I apologise, but I'm stepping in for Martin. And this is about intellectual sovereignty, critical Indigenous studies is the title. In his seminal work entitled Tribal Secrets, Recovering American Indian Intellectual Traditions, published in 1995, Osage scholar Robert Warrior wrote, and I quote, "I contend it is now critical for American Indian intellectuals committed to sovereignty to realise that we too must struggle for sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, and allow the definition and articulation of what that means to emerge as we critically reflect on that struggle." So Warrior's contention that Indigenous intellectuals must struggle for intellectual sovereignty is as relevant today as it was over 27 years ago. Indigenous scholars struggle daily within the Academy with the institutional disavowal of our sovereignties, the disregard for our intellectual worth, the disingenuous collegial engagement, the disinterest in Indigenous priorities, the appropriation and commodification of our knowledges, and the insubstantial fiscal investment in our research and teaching, all on unceded Indigenous lands. Thus, it is timely and relevant to consider critical Indigenous studies as a form of intellectual sovereignty that challenges Western disciplinary knowledge produced about Indigenous people within the context of First World nations. There are three disclaimers I want to make regarding this paper. The first is recognition that I am not addressing, and I'm not going to do an acknowledgement of country, I'm just saying because this is my great-great-grandmother's country, so you're all welcome. I'm not addressing the intellectual sovereignty within Indigenous communities. Instead, my focus is the Academy. Second, I acknowledge that critical Indigenous studies exist beyond the countries that I am focusing on, but cannot address in this paper. And third, I am not offering a detailed history of, nor covering all the issues relevant to the development of critical Indigenous studies in Canada, US, Hawaii, Aotearoa, and Australia. Instead, my modest claim is to highlight the intellectual sovereignty of critical Indigenous studies by reflecting on some of the historical, institutional and epistemological issues associated with building the discipline. Sovereignty is not a word invented by Indigenous people. In her groundbreaking book, Indigenous Sovereignty Matters, Lenape scholar Joanne Barker explains how the European conceptualisation of sovereignty justified conquest and possession of Indigenous territories. She states that Indigenous peoples do not necessarily share the same understanding of sovereignty or its relevance to the living of our everyday lives. However, since the Second World War, Indigenous discourse has deployed the concept sovereignty usefully to foreshadow social and legal rights to political, economic and cultural self-determination. An overview of the literature on Indigenous sovereignty since the 1970s supports Barker's proposition that as a concept it has multiple meanings. In this body of scholarship, the definition of sovereignty can refer to Indigenous people who have never surrendered their lands, to illegal occupation, to prior inherent rights in territories, to belonging to a particular Indigenous people, to holding tribal citizenship, to a political and moral claim to inclusion within settler colonial states, and to recognition as First Peoples, and to treatying as sovereign nations. These varying conceptualisations of Indigenous sovereignty share a singular point of reference and refusal: the imposition of an alien state sovereignty. In the past decade, Indigenous scholarship concerned primarily with the distribution of power within Indigenous territories has illuminated the operations of the state's racialised, jurisprudential and political reach. Bored yet? No. This is evident in reading Mohawk Order Simpson's book, Mohawk Interrupters, Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States, Métis Chris Anderson's Métis Race Recognition and the Struggle for Indigenous Peoplehood, and Dene Glenn Couillard's Redskin White Mask, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, and of course Joanne Barker's Sovereignty Matters, Locations of Contestation and Possibility in Indigenous Struggles for Self-Determination. And there is a Gurrunpool scholar, Aileen Moreton-Robinson's The White Possessive Power and Indigenous Sovereignty. This literature about Indigenous sovereignty contests the legitimacy of state sovereign refuses settler state recognition and asserts our nation status as distinct peoplehood. In theorising Indigenous sovereignty and the conditions of our people, we are exercising our Indigenous intellectual sovereignty within universities, and we are building a corpus of Indigenous knowledges and demarcating our intellectual territory. Historically, the study of Indigenous peoples is tied to the disciplinary knowledge of anthropology, which was particularly useful to different colonial administrations prior to World War II. In the 19th century, anthropologists were fixated with the study of Indigenous peoples' racial attributes, then shifted focus in mid-20th century to the study of our cultural attributes. As I discuss elsewhere, this transition from the study of race to the study of culture did not preclude the former from influencing the latter. In the 1960s, anthropological discourse shaped disciplines such as history, archaeology, linguistics and political science, and the study of Aboriginal people gained traction in ways it had not in previous centuries. For example, anthropology influenced how archaeologists interpreted early hominid behaviour and cultural practices, and in the discipline of history, anthropological knowledge was used to support arguments for the validity and legitimacy of oral history. As much as anthropology influenced other disciplines, it was also influenced by social changes during and after World War II and the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This declaration, by explicitly conferring rights on all humans, provided a means for oppressed groups to mobilise politically, influencing the decolonisation of African countries in the 1950s and 60s. Other social movements began to flourish as well, particularly during the years of the Vietnam War. So concurrent with this broader political activism, universities became sites for the cultivation and promotion of anti-war sentiment. In the 60s and 70s, they were fertile years for the growth of an Indigenous sovereignty movement around the globe, and television beamed our protests into middle-class suburban homes. A rights discourse entered public and political consciousness. Universities were not outside this discourse, and different fields of study emerged: Native studies, Maori studies, women's studies, gay and lesbian studies, African American studies, peace studies, and ethnic studies emerged basically during this period. Over the next 2 decades, Indigenous scholars entered university in unprecedented numbers, and their intellectual sovereignty contested the non-Indigenous study of Indigenous people. As we heard from Professor Warrior, I'm just going to go over some of that stuff that he talked about yesterday with Lynn Cook. So in the 1970s, this influx of Indigenous scholars facilitated debates about whether Indigenous programs should become disciplines. Similar discussions occurred in New Zealand, Hawaii and Canada, but not in Australia, where Aboriginal people were still struggling to gain access to universities. In 1976, only 78 Australian Aboriginal people held university degrees. Rigney argues that the pivot for Aboriginal people entering higher education was the Racial Discrimination Act, which made it difficult for universities to racially exclude Indigenous people, and also the work of the National Aboriginal Education Committee, which was formed in 1983, which increased Indigenous student numbers in higher education and advocated for Indigenous education and support centres. So we are late to the game in Australia. On Turtle Island, Indigenous scholars' debates about what constituted Indigenous studies as a discipline were informed by and connected to Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty movements. Indigenous scholars began to define the terms of their intellectual sovereignty within universities. And Sioux scholar and elder Elizabeth Cooklin argues that in the United States, a concerted effort by Native scholars to address what should constitute Native American studies occurred at Princeton University in March 1970. She states, and I quote, "What many Native scholars of the era wanted, understood, was that an academic discipline requires that a body of intellectual information, such as the natives of this land possess about the world, be internally organised, normatively regulated and consensually communicated," full stop. So the core discussions were concerned with the defence of Indigenous lands, nationhood, as well as Indigenous knowledges and rights. And after this initial gathering, further symposia were held to define the disciplinary principles of Native American studies. So Native American studies would focus, as Robert pointed, on the endogenous study of Indigenous cultures and history, with Indigenous belief systems constituting their founding differentiation from traditional disciplines that pursued exogenous studies of Native American communities. Two concepts would be key drivers in the discipline: Indigenousness, encompassing culture, place and philosophy, and sovereignty, including history and law. So published in the same year as Cook Glen, Māori scholar Mason Jury wrote an overview of the development of Māori studies in New Zealand universities, and he noted that the field was uncomfortably constituted by, quote, being an area of study in its own right, an academic discipline and a potential component of every other area of study, end of quote. While acknowledging that Māori studies has been, quote, enriched by the several disciplines of law, science, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, history, education and sociology, end of quote, Jury argued that Māori philosophies, worldviews, language and methods form the basis of Māori studies within the academy. He explained that Māori studies is based on a Māori-centred approach to producing knowledge, one that is neither exclusively traditional nor Western in orientation. He noted that, and I quote, a greater emphasis on whānau, family models, group learning and peer support, as well as the observation of some customary practices, tend to distinguish Māori studies taught by Māori scholars. The Indigenous focus on endogenous approach to history, language, politics, culture, literature and traditions was also reflected in the development of Native studies in Canada, Native Hawaiian studies in Hawaii, and later Aboriginal studies in Australia. These early thought leaders understood the importance of creating a discipline within the academy that privileged Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing in the production of our knowledges. Intellectual sovereignty was strategically deployed to build our epistemological foundation and expand the discipline's territory. Despite the traction gained by Indigenous scholarship and the growth of Indigenous studies, it did not remain the preserve of Indigenous academics. In the late 20th century, non-Indigenous scholars continue to dominate Indigenous studies, requiring the development of a new epistemological strategy from Indigenous scholars. In the 21st century, this strategy is evidenced by the emergence of critical Indigenous studies, which is expanding and demarking its epistemological territory from Indigenous studies through the intellectual sovereignty of a critical mass of Indigenous scholars. This new body of work disrupts the certainty of disciplinary knowledge produced in the 20th century, when the study of Indigenous peoples was and remains to a large degree the knowledge power domain of non-Indigenous scholars, categorised as Indigenous studies within First World nations. I use the term First World not as a definitive concept, but one that positions Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Hawaii, particularly since the Cold War, as being politically aligned within a global community of dominant white wealthy industrial capitalist countries such as Britain and the United States of America. First World nations that continue to occupy unceded Indigenous lands and share a British and US imperial history. In these countries, critical Indigenous studies has traction, although the specific historical, cultural and geographical context of formation and content varies. It is a discipline, a knowledge power domain where distinct work is produced, taught, researched and disseminated by and for Indigenous scholars. Critical Indigenous studies is multicultural, multinational and transdisciplinary. It is the home of Indigenous-centred knowledge production where the object of study is colonising power, irrespective of the phenomena identified by the signifier Indigenous. Critical Indigenous studies premise is that the colonising power operates through a set of regulatory mechanisms, disciplinary knowledges and procedures that have the role or function and theme, even when they are unsuccessful, of securing power. Colonising power is relational, but, and I quote Foucault, it is not founded on itself or generated by itself, Mechanisms of power are intrinsic part of all of these relations, and in a circular way, they are both cause and effect, end of quote. So meshed within colonising power that is both enabling and constraining, the political and discursive concern of critical Indigenous studies is to mobilise Indigenous epistemologies as our foundations of knowledge power, informed by the cultural domains of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous scholars from different disciplines and nations ask new questions of old problems, recognising that colonisation is an everyday practice and it requires further evaluation. A strength of critical Indigenous studies scholarship lies in a consciousness of the different cultural knowledge toolkits we use, including those that are shaped by Western disciplinary and discursive processes we wish to understand and analyse. The adjective critical we use to qualify Indigenous studies to demarcate Indigenous and non-Indigenous analytics, which we extend beyond the endogenous studies of indigeneity to the exogenous study of colonisation. The coherence of Indigenous studies developed by non-Indigenous scholars lies in a multidisciplinary, problem-orientated approach, the focus of which is the study of Aboriginal Indigenous people, and it achieves epistemological coherence through the objects of its study and differentiation. The study of Indigenous peoples was important in the development of modernity's preoccupation with defining a hierarchy of humanists based on racial differentiation. As Langton argues, and I quote, "Indigenous studies is primarily an artefact of the colonial encounter," end of quote. So Indigenous knowledges, the modes of inquiry we deploy, the methods we develop, and the ethical and cultural protocols that inform our academic practice are not the same as non-Indigenous scholars. Indigenous embodied knowledges can be engaged by non-Indigenous scholars, but they do not produce them. Similar arguments have been made by feminists regarding how men can operationalise feminist analytics, but they do not experience or know the world as women. This is one of the ways in which feminists have differentiated their analytics from patriarchal knowledge production in demarcating the epistemological boundaries of feminism. Women's studies situated and defined itself institutionally by privileging gender as a contested category of analysis within knowledge production, signifying epistemologically a differentiation from heteronormative masculine disciplines. And women's studies was built by feminist scholars focusing on the social location of women and exposing how disciplines were complicit with sexist and androcentric agendas of public institutions. Recognising that knowledge is always socially situated enabled feminists to operationalise women's lives as a source for producing knowledge. Within critical Indigenous studies, relations of ruling come into view from the actualities of the Indigenous bodily existence in our everyday lives. In exploring the conditions of colonisation, we utilise our cultural knowledges to produce critical insights about our lives and others. We understand that knowledge is socially situated and culturally connected to our lands. Indigenous lives provide the starting point for asking new and critical questions about Indigenous being, doing and knowing, based on the presuppositions of relatedness to place, non-human relatives, people and the earth. As such, the connections between Indigenous knowledges, relatedness and embodiment distinguishes and marks the intellectual sovereignty and epistemological ground of critical Indigenous studies scholarship. Our tendency is not to telescope in on an object of interest, but to understand the object in the context of its relatedness. As Métis scholar Chris Anderson argues, critical Indigenous studies exposes the ontological density of our being in our difference and how we have been represented as different. The process of Indigenous differentiation is not solely one of choice, nor is it epistemologically and ontologically constraining. Critical Indigenous studies is a knowledge-powered domain whereby scholars operationalise Indigenous knowledges to develop theories, build academic infrastructure and inform our cultural and ethical practices. This critical work we do to challenge the disciplinary power knowledge structures and discourses through which Indigenous people have been framed and known. We are exercising sovereign intellectual warriorship as warrior states, and I quote, "It is a decision we make in our minds, in our hearts, and in our bodies to be sovereign." This is a process that enables us to be comfortable with uncertainty. Building the discipline of critical Indigenous studies also requires a requires a conscientious engagement with the politics of Indigenous citation, one that is mindful of how citational practices can be a tool for either the rarefication of or resistance to non-Indigenous hierarchies of knowledge production. Indigenous scholarly citation leads to connection with other Indigenous scholars' work. It is a way of strategically deploying Indigenous relationality in our interests. So citing other Indigenous scholars' work, whether via critique or affirmation, can provide leads to other Indigenous scholars, often to what is a poorly disseminated, poorly indexed and uncited Indigenous scholarship. The scholarship's there. It's there. People just don't look for it. The role of citation within critical Indigenous studies is that it attributes status to the discipline. It is akin to scholarly scaffolding, where every publication builds on the foundation of previous work. The frequency of citations is a measure of relative importance or the quality of the scholarship. And Indigenous academic citation practices are integral to Indigenous sovereignty as it increases the disciplinary knowledges of critical Indigenous studies. That's a big tip for all you emerging young Indigenous scholars. Cite your people. And if it's crap, say it's crap, but cite them. In defining the attributes of a discipline, and I think this is what we haven't really talked about at Indigenous studies as discipline. In defining the attributes of a discipline, it should have institutional recognition and an international community with a professional association and specialist journals. Betcher and Trowler argue that, quote, "international currency is an important criterion as it is a general, though not shapely defined set of notions of academic credibility, intellectual substance and appropriateness of the subject matter," end of quote. Now, critical Indigenous studies has acquired many of these disciplinary attributes and more, including the criteria for our knowledge, truth, science, impact and methods that regulate our access to it. Critical Indigenous studies has produced practitioners with expertise and economies of value, whose work has become seminal to the discipline. We owe much to the intellectual sovereignty of those whose work continues to shape the discipline. To name a few, Professor Vine Delora, Professor Elizabeth Cook-Lynn, Maori Professors Linda Tuwai-Smith and Brendan Hokafitu, Kanaki Maoli Professors Hunani K. Trask and Mayalani Maya, Mohawk Professors Patricia Monte-Agnes, Taiki Alfred, and Ghana Professor Lester Irabina, Yemen and Bidjara Professor Marcia Langton, and Torres Strait Islander Professor Martin Nakada. So critical Indigenous studies manufactures discourse in abundance, articles, monographs, conference papers, books, as well as ongoing contractual and untenured jobs. Scholars within the emerging discipline have secured funding, research awards and contracts. Critical Indigenous studies also generates prestige and scholarly status. Globally, critical Indigenous studies is multidisciplinary, multinational and multicultural, with an epistemological territory that includes Native American studies, Indigenous studies, Native Hawaiian studies, Maori studies and of course Aboriginal studies. While the knowledge power domain of critical Indigenous studies holds a familiarity and similarity, there are also discernible differences which can be attributed structurally to the colonising society's education system, history and national traits. Despite these differences, critical Indigenous studies scholars do engage with each other's work. As a discipline, critical Indigenous studies is serviced by established Indigenous controlled journals, some of which have existed since the 1970s. And more recently, to name a few, Alternative, the Journal of Maori and Pacific Development in New Zealand, the Aboriginal Policy Journal in Canada, the Native Hawaiian Journal, the Australian Journal of Indigenous Education, Native American Indigenous Studies Journal, that belongs to NAISA. So Indigenous monographs are being published in unprecedented numbers, with several US publishing houses competing for book manuscripts such as Minnesota Press, Arizona Press, Duke, Nebraska, University of Toronto Press, Otago, and University of Hawaii Press. A third indicator of critical Indigenous studies disciplinary growth is the presence of Indigenous professional associations and research centres that have been established to organise research-related activities, as well as convening conferences to enable intellectual engagement and the formation of national international networks. And of course, we've already sung the song about Native American Indigenous Studies Association, and the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education also attracts Indigenous scholars and a small number of non-Indigenous scholars from around the world. The establishment of Indigenous research and education centres, tribal colleges and departments have played a strong role in developing transnational connections, as well as being committed to working with local Indigenous communities. The nature and extent of this institutionalisation and the conditions of existence, though often marginalised and under-resourced, evince intellectual sovereignty in the emergence of the discipline of critical Indigenous studies. Perhaps one of the most important 21st century interventions in developing critical Indigenous studies has been NAISA. The origins of the association began with Robert Warrior's idea of intellectual sovereignty and Ojibwe scholar Jeannie O'Brien's concern to build the professional infrastructure to provide the grounds for scholarly engagement for Native studies and Indigenous studies scholars. 3.5 decades have passed since the initial departments of Native Studies have been set up in the US, though Warrior and O'Brien have participated in the Indigenous Professors Association, as Robert kind of talked about, and I'm going to skip that because I think we know about NAISA. But what I want to say about it is it's established a journal, independent website, promotes Indigenous intellectual sovereignty and the importance of an association to critical Indigenous studies is the provision of a professional and intellectual place and space for the development of new Indigenous ideas and relationships. Despite these achievements, Métis scholar Chris Anderson argues that what is important for longevity of critical Indigenous studies is its departmental status within universities. Anderson notes that little attention has been paid to the institutional location of critical Indigenous studies, as the preoccupation over the past 4 decades has been the intellectual work of demarcating its epistemological boundaries. He argues there is a correlation between the lack of institutional power and the lack of engagement with the intellectual work of critical Indigenous studies. In Canada, the current changes and austerity measures being operationalised by universities has resulted in older disciplines staking a claim to decolonisation by including Indigenous studies as part of their curriculum. This is positive in that it enhances the quality of scholarship and the support for the discipline. However, this in turn makes them highly competitive with Native Studies departments for students, staff, and institutional power. Older established departments have disciplinary credibility and resources. Anderson explicates that critical Indigenous studies must recognise the possibility of its conditions through achieving departmental status, refocusing our intellectual production on density rather than our differences to deal with the immediacy of our indigeneity within modernity, and grounding our curriculum locally to engage with Indigenous sociality. He notes that grounding our curriculum in a local Indigenous context gives critical Indigenous studies a competitive edge that other departments would flounder to match. Anderson concludes that establishing a discipline requires institutional credibility and viability. The attainment of departmental status within universities would ensure sustainability for critical Indigenous studies by providing the institutional infrastructure needed to achieve academic excellence, intellectual integrity and rigour. In the past 2 decades, Indigenous studies programs in the US has risen from 61 to 130, and in Canada from 8 to 30. He argues that, and I quote, Indigenous studies units must continue to work on tending to our own Indigenous to Indigenous encounters, collaborations and comparisons, connecting our own departmental islands across university contexts and regional national borders, end of quote. Anderson's argument that departmental and institutional status is important for the sustainability of critical Indigenous studies. But in the Australian context, out of 42 universities, only one Department of Indigenous Studies exists, and the director is sitting right down there. And that is Macquarie University. There are, There are 5 schools of Indigenous Aboriginal Studies: Curtin, James Cook, University of Western Australia, Charles Darwin University and Charles Sturt University. 36 Australian universities have not demonstrated the fiscal leadership to create Indigenous Studies departments or schools. Instead, it is cheaper to run an Indigenous Studies program tied to existing non-Indigenous disciplines and programs. Indigenous academic staff usually teach into these programs, which rely on soft funding for government to subsidise administrative costs and student support. Indigenous studies in Australia are often located within disciplines such as linguistics, prehistory, history, anthropology, education and political science. And within these disciplines, the focus is on history, culture, social, political and economic development of Indigenous people. And most Indigenous studies minors and majors are usually taught by non-Indigenous academics who produce most of the literature and win most of the research grants. Institutionally, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars who teach Indigenous studies are located outside faculties, and their work is marginalised by omission. It is often the case that Indigenous studies courses are taught by Indigenous scholars because they are tied to a reconciliation action plan that perceives the teaching of these courses as a moral obligation rather than an intellectual endeavour. In Australia, the debate over what constitutes critical Indigenous studies as a discipline has not gained the same traction as elsewhere. However, Torres Strait Islander scholar Martin Nakada has over many years produced scholarship and stimulated discussion about Indigenous studies in Australia. In the Wentworth lecture presented in 2004, Nakada argued that there were limitations with Indigenous scholarship's focus on what constitutes Indigenous knowledge, which he asserts is informed primarily by a politics of indigenisation. He defines indigenisation as, and I quote, making a space within universities that is recognisably Indigenous, a space formed by inserting and asserting content, practice and processes that culturally affirm Indigenous people, students, community and perspective, end of quote. He explains that indigenisation has been important for claiming space within the academy, but as an intellectual project, it is reductive because it produces simplistic oppositions of us and them, the Western and the Indigenous. Instead, Nakada proposes that what is required is an understanding of the cross-cultural space in which we function and produce knowledge. For Nakada, this requires an understanding of the cultural interface, a space that consists of complex, multiple, historical and discursive intersections where Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledges are entangled. It is a place of constant negotiation, contradiction and tension. He argues that this is the life world of many Indigenous people who have learned to accept ambiguity and contradiction as part of being Indigenous. He advocates for scholarship that engages with the traditional disciplines to demonstrate how this knowledge is limited in its ability to understand Indigenous peoples. Nakada notes at this point in Australia's history, we need more Indigenous scholars to undertake this kind of intellectual labour, to move beyond our fixation with the politics of indigenisation and by implication an Indigenous endogenous approach to knowledge production. He advocates that the complexity of our entanglements at the cultural interface requires a more sophisticated and nuanced form of analysis. For Nakada et al., a more nuanced form of analysis rests on A, the positioning effect of knowledge or claims to know, B, practices that order, privilege and operationalise some claims to know by excluding or silencing other, C, at the complex Indigenous Western interface, forms of scepticisms and epistemic attitudes are necessary to consider the delimitations and dispositions of both Western and Indigenous theorising for understanding Indigenous contemporary social realities, end of quote. NACADA's 3 propositions identify the conditions of existence of knowing, renders invisible the power knowledge nucleus that enables knowing. If knowledge and power are entangled in this way, then what are the conditions of possibility available to us to disentangle the relationship between knowledge and power outside of scepticism and epistemic attitudes? What positioning effect of knowledge or claims to know are we discussing? How do we know when they are operating? What are the practices referred to and who are the practitioners and how do they operate institutionally? These questions make power relations visible in the positioning effect of knowledge or claims to know, which in the context of critical Indigenous studies is inextricably tied to disciplines and Indigenous knowledges. For example, the multidisciplinary, multicultural and global nature of critical Indigenous studies means it is a site where our disciplinary training and Indigenous knowledges incorporate certain types of knowledge as well as contesting and excluding others. Professor Brenda Hoka-Fitu advocates that our intellectual sovereignty requires Indigenous scholars to make an intervention into Indigenous studies, one that challenges current fixations with identity. He advocates a post-Indigenous studies must refocus its attention on the immediacy of indigeneity in modernity. Hoka-Fitu argues that Indigenous scholarship's preoccupation with colonisation and identity formation has led to an overextended engagement with the universalising project to explain ourselves and to make ourselves known. Hoka-Fitu requires us to shift our concerns away from being preoccupied with identity fetishism, origin stories and false binary thinking. We need to address the ways in which essentialisms have come to impede Indigenous peoples' ontology so that we can move beyond the coloniser's definition of our humanity. He asks us to consider what kind of subjectivities have we lost and what has been erased in continuing and reinscribing traditional culture. What have we missed in our pursuit of colonial verification? Hoka-Fitu is not disavowing Indigenous knowledge systems, quite the contrary. What he argues is that Indigenous studies reproduces the Western preoccupation with a metaphysical ontology by making identity the epistemological a priori in scholarship. He advocates that a post-Indigenous studies, we need to understand our embodiment as manifestations of insurrections of knowledge to make a new way of unintelligibility and of radical intent, refusing the Western demand to be an all-knowing subject that believes it masters what it knows. Hoka-Fitu's important theoretical insurrection offers us a mandate to consider making critical Indigenous studies monstrous through our intellectual sovereignty. In the introduction to the Rutledge Handbook of Critical Indigenous Studies, which you should all buy, Hoka-Fitu argues that critical Indigenous studies has, quote, sought to criticise the unsettler white claims to possession over knowledge itself. Second, critical Indigenous studies refers to scholarship grounded in resistance to multiple forms of violence and microaggressions that Indigenous people and communities face every day in their neo-colonial realities. Third, critical Indigenous studies refers to scholarship that upholds sovereign claims to Indigenous lands, languages, cultures, ecologies, ontologies, and existentiality. To conclude, the intellectual sovereignty of critical Indigenous studies scholarship is flourishing, but it requires embedding institutionally to secure resources to enable it to be a substantive site of Indigenous knowledge production, publication and dissemination. We need the auspices of Indigenous professional organisations to promote and support Indigenous scholarship as a global movement. Most Indigenous scholars who are producing and contributing to the discipline are doing so within institutions that do not invest in their intellectual labour. Despite these constraints, Indigenous scholars are doing the heavy lifting and are committed to developing critical Indigenous studies as a discipline with global reach. They extend and are guided by the work of our intellectual sovereign ancestors to offer locations of engagement that place, provoke and entice our thinking beyond the familiar and the comfortable. They have heeded the call to intellectual warriorship through deploying incisive critique, analytical acumen, to propose new ideas to contemplate within critical Indigenous studies. As I have acknowledged, the aim of scholarship in the past decade has been to engage with early configurations of Indigenous studies, to expand and make our discursive and material horizons the territory of critical Indigenous studies. We do not seek to limit, nor will we be limited by what those horizons may be. We should not waver in our objective to challenge the knowledges that have been produced about us by following in the footsteps of those who courageously created the possibilities of Indigenous scholarship some 7 decades ago. Globally, critical Indigenous studies is being strategically deployed as a knowledge power domain where distinct work is being produced, taught, researched and disseminated by and for Indigenous scholars within the Academy. This knowledge benefits our communities and nations directly and indirectly. We are future-proofing Indigenous knowledges in different ways from our ancestors, whose intellectual sovereignty continues to guide and sustain our work. Within universities, the Indigenous reality is we are engaged in an epistemic war within the confines of institutional and disciplinary structures that are unwelcoming of Indigenous knowledges. In this epistemic war, our casualties at times are high. Some battles have been lost and some have been won, but we are not defeated. Thank you.
So oftentimes in a conference situation, it's really difficult to sort of call upon the audience to, conceptualise questions for the two speakers who we've just heard from. So I've made some notes, but sometimes during the course of the speaking you get sucked in and you forget to make the notes, so just bear with me. So we're talking about Indigenous studies as a rights discourse. Susan and Aileen together identified that irregardless of whether it's a Canadian situation or the Australian situation, institutions are late to the game. It's very kind, actually, even to put it in those sorts of words. We need those thought leaders. We want to recognise those thought leaders who have built, but we need to be able to continue to build that intellectual sovereignty. Not to take the space away, but to build that further. And to build a discipline within our ways of knowing, being and doing. These ways of thinking are nuanced, they are complex. We could take out, when Susan asked the question, reconciliation on whose terms, we could take out any of those concepts that we as Indigenous people find really important to us and our work within the institution to ask the question, on whose terms is this being mobilised? Aileen reminds us that knowledge is situated, and both speakers talked about the need for us to be able to situate that knowledge within the local area, building and reaching out to a global context. Aileen referenced Robert in sense of, and here I'm paraphrasing, the need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's part of a conversation that actually hasn't been spoken out loud very often within the Australian context between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who would seek to occupy this space called Indigenous Studies. So Susan gave us the concept of, we do how we do, all right? Aileen took that, the space of Indigenous studies and the building of Indigenous studies, challenges us to frame it within the notion that we are engaged in an epistemic war. How ironic then that the University of Toronto plants a tree of peace.
Walawani, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded sovereign lands today, and I acknowledge elders past and present and recognise the continuity of knowledge that nurtures country and community. And I'd also like to extend this to all mob here, and also particularly to my colleagues in the Department of Indigenous Studies, the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, and Wulunkamaroo. So I'm a PhD candidate and associate lecturer in the Department of Indigenous Studies. We are an all-Indigenous and highly collaborative department whose curriculum is designed around moving past ideas of deficit discourse and negative thinking about mob, and instead thinking about how brilliant we all are and how we can forge better futures for ourselves outside of the limits of what white people think we're capable of. As part of my teaching, I convene a second-year unit, ABST 2060, Indigenous Histories and Knowledges, and this covers, as you may guess, Indigenous histories and knowledges. But more than that, we think about Indigenous histories from the perspective of Indigenous knowledges. So it's not just what Indigenous people have done in the past, but instead how knowledges inform those histories and how we learn histories from those knowledges. And also the different ways that different mobs engage in those knowledges. So we move past this kind of united Aboriginal singular narrative of what Indigenous history might be, and acknowledge that there are 500 different histories of this continent, if not more. So after launching in 2019 at the Forum of Indigenous Research Excellence's biggest mob history symposium, the unit first ran in semester 2 of 2020 and has run in semester 2 every semester since then. So we're about halfway through the 4th iteration of the unit, and so I've become a bit reflective about it all. Now, at the end of last year, I had a student come see me in my office, and they were an exchange student from Canada, a non-Indigenous student, but she was majoring in Indigenous Studies. And she took my class as part of her exchange studies. She was quite an engaged student, but when she stopped by my office at the end of the semester, she said to me that she didn't expect to be as challenged as she had been throughout the semester. And I asked her what she meant by that, because from where I was standing, she didn't seem to be struggling. She had always had really brilliant contributions to class. She did the readings. And she was doing well in the graded assessments as well. So from my perspective, she didn't seem to be challenged, didn't seem to be struggling at all. But she said to me that she didn't realise how different Indigenous history and knowledges are here compared to back home. And that when she was picking her units, she had the option to do non-major specific units and just get a block of credit towards her degree. But she chose to do this unit because she thought it was an as easy way to progress in her major, or something to that effect. Instead, she found herself really challenged, because while a lot of the core concepts were the same, so things like settler colonialism, relationality, connection with land and ancestors, she felt that she started a bit on the back foot because she knew nothing about Indigenous history here. And I said to her she wasn't actually alone in that, because the average student who comes through 2060 also doesn't know anything about Indigenous people here. And even if they do, they've rarely engaged with Indigenous history from Indigenous people. Instead, they've been taught by non-Indigenous teachers or non-Indigenous lecturers who often centre themselves or present themselves as being the most knowledgeable person in the room. The unit was designed in a way to fill a few gaps and to address that kind of issue. But first and foremost, it was designed for the Indigenous Studies major. It follows on from 2 first-year units, introducing Indigenous Australia and also our Direct Country unit. Completion of one of these is a prerequisite for studying 2060, so you're expected to come into this unit at least having done one of these. But you can apply for a waiver if you want to enrol and have not completed one of these units. The other gap 2060 fills is the lack of Indigenous history taught at Macquarie University. I did my undergraduate at Macquarie. I did mostly Australian history units, but not once did we engage with Indigenous history, let alone Indigenous voices or perspectives or ideas about that history. And while admittedly I didn't do every unit that was available, and the courses have changed a bit since then, there are still no Indigenous staff in the Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie. And as far as I'm aware, the only Indigenous perspectives in that curriculum are actually the guest lectures that I have done for them, that are tacked on to the final week of the semester. The other Indigenous history topics are delivered by non-Indigenous lecturers. And so they rarely engage with topics outside of things like colonisation, native title, and the stolen generations. And they always tend to focus on negative experiences or trauma of mob, not on things like black joy, success, and the possibilities of our futures. So this places 2016 in an interesting position. The Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie is, as Prof said this morning, the only Indigenous Studies department in Australia. We are entirely staffed by Indigenous people, and the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures runs out of our department. We're a very collaborative department. We collaborate with mob from around the world, and we have several Coachella PhD students who come through our department. And Bronwyn may correct me on this, but I also think we're the most prolific publishers in the Faculty of Arts. So we are pretty deadly, if I do say so myself. The history and archaeology curriculum at Macquarie is also quite highly ranked. We want to talk about rankings, both in Australia and internationally. It's a leading institution for ancient history in particular, but Indigenous history is not part of that curriculum. Not really, anyway. 2060 is a required unit only in the Department of Indigenous Studies, only part of the Indigenous Studies major. It's designed for this major, but it offers an opportunity for students studying history and archaeology to learn from Indigenous people about Indigenous history, if that's something that they want to do. But it is a really big if. Now, this is the spread of 2060 enrolments by degree from 2020 until now. I don't have specific major enrolments. Some of this is a bit anecdotal, sorry. But you can see that the two biggest enrolment areas are actually education and the General Bachelor of Arts degree. And you can major in Indigenous Studies in both of those courses. So some of this data will be Indigenous Studies majors. From my observation, other major areas in both of these degrees tend to be history, sociology, gender studies, geography, and anthropology. In terms of history, Macquarie offers a few ways you can study it. So you can major in ancient or modern history as part of the general arts degree. You can also study a Bachelor of Ancient History or a Bachelor of Archaeology. And in the archaeology degree, you can also minor in Indigenous Studies. So a small number of archaeology students will have a minor, but not a major in Indigenous Studies. Anecdotally, the teaching students or education students who tend to come through 2060 are actually majoring in geography, not history. And most of them are primary school education students, so not secondary or high school students or teachers. People majoring in history or archaeology are more likely, or the most likely to have not done one of the prerequisites. And so they apply through a prereq waiver. They're also the most likely to drop out of the unit before the census date, which is at the end of week 3. So on average, each offering I receive and approve approximately 5 or 6 prereq waivers from history students specifically. Yet on average, there's maybe 3 history and archaeology students who actually go on to complete the course. So this means that the low enrolment data for history and archaeology students isn't necessarily a lack of enrolments, it's actually a lack of completion. Now, it's not my job to retain history students. This is an Indigenous Studies unit. It's designed for Indigenous Studies and taught by Indigenous Studies. But it's also fascinating to me to watch this pattern repeat itself each year or each semester. Because if we go back to the enrolment data, we can see that there is a wide variety of degrees represented, everything from education to psychology, to speech and hearing sciences, law, commerce, environmental sciences, media, medical studies, so on. So I've been thinking over the last few offerings about why there's this lack of engagement from history students, because the unit is about history. We teach history. I would have thought personally that history students would be one of the more frequent students to come through the course, because it is uniquely placed to fulfill their needs without putting the burden on the history department. And I think it ultimately comes down to the way Indigenous Studies is positioned in this space, and particularly in relation to history as an academic discipline, which is actually a bit ironic considering that's what we teach in ABST 2060. Now, a while ago, I went to pick up my partner from a supervisor meeting, and she's a history PhD student. And so I went into the history department for the first time in a while. And while I was there, I was waiting by a desk, and one of the other PhD students started talking to me. This is a white man doing a PhD in history, in classics. And so the conversation naturally ended up, it's what's your research on? And I told him I'm looking at the history of relations between Indigenous and Jewish communities in Australia since 1788. And he was like, oh, you're doing history, who's your supervisor? I said, Professor Brumman Carlson. He went, oh, I don't know her. And I was like, well, that's a shame. She's the head of the Department of Indigenous Studies. And he went, we have a Department of Indigenous Studies? And he was genuinely shocked. I could see his brain cells banging together. He processed this new information. And then he hit me with, but why are you there if you're studying history? And then the real kicker was, is it because you're Indigenous? And thankfully, Evie came out of the meeting and saved me from this interaction. But the conversation kept playing around in my head. The idea that only Indigenous people study in Indigenous studies is a really common one. And more than once, I've been asked if I'm there because I didn't make it in history. But what really got me about the conversation is the idea that you can't study history if you're not in a history department. I think that every one of my colleagues engages with history in one way or another. And every person that I've met who works in the Faculty of Arts engages with history in one way or another. Yet this man was genuinely gobsmacked that I would bother doing a history-focused PhD outside of the history and archaeology department, as if it made me less of a historian. I actually think I'm a better historian than him, but... It's no secret that Indigenous research in Australia has historically been dominated by white people talking about us, or with, let alone with us, or at least having us talk for ourselves. Students at university level have been learning about Indigenous people from a distinctly non-Indigenous lens for most of, if not their entire lives. What they're learning is also, from my observations, generally an amalgamation of knowledge and information taken from the Northern Territory or Central Australia and applied with shockingly little critical thought to the rest of us. So people enter Indigenous studies at Macquarie expecting two things. They either want to learn about dot painting and dancing and didgeridoos and boomerangs, or they want to just listen and learn from the Indigenous students in the class. They don't actually want to participate. They just want to sit there and apparently take it all in via osmosis. But ABST 2060 is neither of those things. It's a discussion-based class. I'm not expecting students to come out experts on Indigenous knowledges. Obviously, I don't think that's even possible. But I want them to at least try. I want them to engage. I want them to take it in some way. But I want them to be able to apply it. I want them to have the ability to recognise that it's important in whatever their career paths take them. Whether they're just studying history or law or psychology, our histories and knowledges play a role in their lives because they're all on our land. In less words, I'm more interested in how they engage and apply these knowledges rather than how well they master them. And to do that, they need to talk and they need to think and they need to be engaged in the materials and the discussions. And this is something I've tried to implement through the assessments for this unit. So there's a series of quizzes, very easy 10-mark questions, or 10 questions rather, at the end of each 3-week module, and I'll talk about the modules in a moment. There's also a minor essay at the end of week 7, and then there's a major assessment in week 13. The major assessment is very, very flexible. While the minor essay is a critical essay, wherein they're expected to engage critically in academic writing, the final assessment has a bit more freedom. I set a series of questions. This year, for example, is 5. Students select one, and then they play to their strengths. So they can submit a mock lesson plan. They can submit informational social media posts, an exhibition or a gallery plan, a business plan, an archaeology report, architectural design, whatever. Whatever helps them process the information and translate it in practical ways to their specific disciplines. So how can they translate what they're learning in the unit to whatever future career they're going to have? And so I'm particularly interested in helping them develop a critical perspective. It's one thing to take on information and write an essay about it, which this semester 90% of them are going through ChatGPT anyway. But if they can apply it to their career, then they've not just taken it in, but they've also understood it, and they've understood the importance of it. So practically, the unit is broken into 3 weekly modules. Each module relates to a particular concept. From a teaching perspective, this is very beneficial because it essentially means we have 3-week discussions. From a student perspective, they get 3 weeks to understand a topic before moving on to something new. And they respond really well to this because I think from their perspective, it actually slows down the unit a bit and they can engage a bit more deeply. Importantly, as well, while not all of the readings are by Indigenous people, every single lecture is. So we use a mixture of lectures by me, pre-recorded guest lectures, and then lectures or other materials that are available online. So for example, this year we've used the SBS series First Inventors. We've also used TED Talks and conference or symposium recordings. This means that the lecture content is actually updated every single offering, so we're always on top of new things that Mob are putting out. But it also means that they get a really wide variety. So while one week they might get a lecture from me, the next week they'll get a lecture by a Darug person, followed by a Nyungar perspective, followed by a Turulawoi perspective, so on and so forth. Now the first block is unofficially called Everything You Knew About Australian History is Racist. We look at where Indigenous history is placed in terms of Australian history. We think about the term prehistory, questions of Indigenous archaeology, or questions why Indigenous archaeology is nearly always considered the prehistory of Australia, but sites like the Blacktown Native Institute are considered colonial heritage. We also consider different ways of engaging with and producing knowledge, what knowledge even is, and then the relationships between knowledge and different disciplines or career areas. And this is where we lose a lot of history students. And I think that's because they're not necessarily ready to hear that there's more than one way to do history. We talk about things like the history wars and the Great Australian Silence, but we also talk about things like history doesn't have to be linear, and sometimes not doing that archaeological project is actually the best outcome. We talk about the fact that there are no Indigenous staff in the history and archaeology department. And some students have a lot to say about this and get really into it, and others get very uncomfortable. And I think that given that the way that many students come into this unit expecting dot paintings and dreaming stories, having this as the first 3 weeks of content makes them really disinclined to engage, and so they end up dropping out. Module 2 considers knowledge about country. So students are introduced to things like songlines and relationality and the idea that history is carried through country. And this includes both the physical land, but also sea country and sky country. We consider different ways of valuing knowledge, different ways of viewing land and sea and sky, and how Western disciplines like astronomy or environmental science or archaeology do or do not engage with knowledges in their practices. And this module in particular, it always draws on guest lectures, which I think is very beneficial to students, and they seem to get a lot from those discussions. Module 3 then takes knowledges from country, so we get a bit more hands-on and practical in the second half of the unit, and we think about things like agriculture and technology and food and medicine and cultural burning, and they're encouraged to do a bit more independent research. So, for example, take an example of an Indigenous food or medicine, learn about it, but then also tell me how you could use that in your everyday recipes. The final module looks to the future, and this was an intentional choice because I think some people get a bit too comfortable thinking about Indigenous people in the past tense. We learn about all these ancient songlines and knowledges and food and medicine, but students really struggle to convert that to the future. And so I always start the final week of the semester asking my class, okay, so now that you know all of this, now you've learned all of this, what role does this have in the future of this content? What role does this have in your future? And they get a bit stumped. So we kind of work through that in the final few weeks of the semester. And this is where I really try and hone in on the application of what they've learned. So for teachers, how does this play out in your practice? For psychologists, how does this play out in your practice? For archaeologists or historians or environmental scientists, what roles do these knowledges and histories have for you? And for some students, this is much clearer. Others struggle a bit more, but I do find that by that point in the semester, they're a bit more willing to be a bit more reflective and think critically about how they can employ this. In general, the unit is very well received. I'm very lucky that I get quite pleasant survey results. I know that's not common for everyone. But it also makes me wonder why, if I get such good feedback from students who do the unit, why isn't there more historical archaeology students engaged in it? And I think, like I said at the start, it ultimately comes down to the way Indigenous Studies is positioned in relation to the academic study of history. And I think Indigenous Studies now is at an interesting turning point where we're starting to really move away from just being the place where Indigenous academics go. We're separating ourselves from being an offset of student engagement units and demonstrating that we are a worthwhile investment. And I think that that really poses a threat to history and archaeology departments who have often relied on white people to do their work. I'm getting like 2 sentences. Sorry. Because we do history here, right? We do history in Indigenous Studies. We have the longest history. And so history departments are getting confronted by that, and I think that they need to be confronted by them. We need to challenge them, and I think we are challenging them. And I think that we've moved past the point where white people get to speak for us. Thank you.
Geez, I'm grateful to be here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Uncle Chegg for the welcome yesterday. And I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future for their ongoing custodianship of the lands and waters where we meet today. I also really want to take this time to extend my thanks as well to the organisers of the conference, the Academy of the Humanities and the University of Queensland for bringing us together. I've said to a few people now, I come from a pretty small department. In fact, it's just me. And so I deeply value the connections I've made over the past couple of days. I have Gamilaroi heritage on mum's side. My ancestors are from the Gunnedah region. On my father's side, I have New Guinean heritage. Our family's from an island called Tatana, which is just off the coast of Port Moresby. And through rituals of naming, my country differs from that of my brothers and sisters, and my country is Ranubata, which means big water. I'm trained primarily in philosophy, particularly moral philosophy, so my approach or my perspective today is, in approaching the themes raised in this conference, is thinking about what it means to be in relation to the natural world. So I'll be, from the perspective of Indigenous Australian and Melanesian or New Guinean knowledges. I'm particularly referring to a lot of Auntie Mary Graham's work and Tyson Younger Porter's work. Okay. So in philosophy, I wanted to keep it structured. So I thought, right, this is an agenda-setting symposium. So I want to particularly focus on this question: what is the role of Indigenous studies in humanities, particularly philosophy, and how might these findings extend to the social sciences? So I hope I can answer this question today. And this is where I ground myself here with this quote. It's from Mason Jury. Relationships between people and the natural environment, between tangible and intangible dimensions, between organic and inorganic material, and between past and future, constitute the foundations upon which Indigenous populations understand the world. I also wanted to use this quote as well to ground my approach today. It comes from geography, but I think it extends to philosophy, particularly the first 3 points. What is the role of Indigenous studies in the humanities? Well, first of all, it's in recognising the depth of colonial heritage in 20th century environmental thought. Secondly, in supporting new Indigenous philosophies, I want to say. And third, articulating environmental imaginaries beyond the settler Indigenous binary. And I just wanted to read my abstract as well, because I think this structures my 2 projects today. We are bombarded with scientific communication about the nature and existential threat of environmental crises, yet we are overwhelmingly unaffected by it. It is also not clear that increasingly vivid portrayals of the catastrophes which exist in our possible futures and the direct impacts that climate inaction will have on our personal livelihoods will motivate substantial and long-term changes in our dominant attitudes and behaviours towards the environment. Additionally, we must take seriously the possibility that global environmental crises are thoroughly resistant to technological, regulatory and economic solution. This sets the stage for what I think is the greatest normative challenge in contemporary moral philosophy, that of both articulating our shared responsibility with the natural world and motivating genuine action in the face of environmental crises. At the intersection of contemporary environmental ethics and ecological science is a theoretically powerful narrative for articulating this shared responsibility. But why aren't these narratives being translated into action? Moral psychologists have identified a comprehensive range of psychological barriers which might explain this inaction. However, I want to propose that these studies are overlooking an important feature from our oldest moral traditions: embodied community practice. In Indigenous Australian and Melanesian ways of being, doing and knowing, cultural knowledge is embodied in the sense that it is sustained and expressed communally through ritual and ceremony. Motivating action requires more than overcoming psychological barriers. It requires that our fundamental ways of being, doing and knowing become embodied, that is, lived knowledges. So I think there's two projects in here. The first one that I'll explain is, well, articulating our shared responsibilities with the natural world. What does that project look like? This is a critical project. In this project, I won't go too much into it. I am critiquing the dominant theories, or I guess directions of inquiry in environmental ethics. I argue that really a lot of the theories that come out of environmental ethics can be summarized by two questions. The first one is, are the rights or interests of beings in the natural world neglected? I think this inquiry is threatened with failure. It's ultimately anthropocentric, I argue. And the second dominant approach in environmental ethics is the natural world intrinsically valuable? Again, I don't think this is a promising line of inquiry. Ultimately, we require a theory in which our evaluation is properly action guiding, a theory which is practical, a theory in which evaluations are not anthropogenic and therefore arbitrary. Anthropogenic just meaning values coming from us, and a theory which is not anthropocentric, that is not based on human interests and concerns. However, I argue that recent works which bring together ecological and Indigenous knowledges, or otherwise grounded in a capabilities approach, are strong candidates. So that Christine Winter is a Maori scholar, and Martha Nussbaum has a really great book that's just come out this year as well. But then I want to add my own approach in this part of the project. What is an environmental responsibility from an Indigenous Australian knowledges perspective and a Melanesian perspective? Well, first of all, I want to build on the literature here, is that being, doing and knowing are deeply interconnected questions. So opposed to Western philosophy, where questions of ontology and morality and epistemology are separate fields of inquiry, I believe Indigenous knowledges brings these questions together. And that is, what we are as human beings grounds what we ought to do and what we ought to know. The story of what we are as human beings from an Indigenous knowledge perspective delineates a responsibility with the natural world. And this relation between being and doing is in Kyle White, for example, is known as collective continuance, or kaitia kitanga in Māori ways of being, doing, knowing. And I'll introduce Gutpela Sindon in Melanesian ways. And Auntie Mary calls this the first law, and it underpins Indigenous Australian knowledges, she argues. So courageous conversation number one, I think one, is that Indigenous Australian and Melanesian knowledges provide a strong account of environmental responsibility, which does not reduce our relationship with the natural world to anthropocentric or anthropogenic values. So philosophy, from our understanding of what we are as human beings to what constitutes knowledge itself, and our understanding of being in relationship with others in the world, can benefit from the rich understandings found in Indigenous studies. This brings me to the second part of the project. Motivating genuine action. So my approach is, well, what explains this resistance to normative change in the face of environmental crises? And here I've examined a lot of psychological literature on barriers to inaction. And I don't think these barriers are adequate. I'll argue that colonial thought is pervasive in environmental ethics, but it's also true in psychological literature. Of the 29 identified barriers of 7 broad categories, only one barrier is actually related to place attachment or anything to do with our connection to place. And it's listed under sunk costs, which means attachment to place is only understood as a question of instrumental value. This assumption is also reflected in literature focusing on place, attachment, and its development in communities. And here I want to read, I think this is important, so I'll just read straight from the paper I'm writing so far. Psychological literature frames a sense of place in various ways. I argue that these ways are also inadequate. So firstly, a sense of place, according to this literature, can be the ambit of a person. That is, their movements through space over a period of time. Quote, much as an animal's home territory may be inferred from the outline of its movements through space, the human ambit enables a person's sense of place to be inferred from their activities in space-time, end quote. A place might be meaningful because it is dependent upon for certain leisure time pursuits which confer personal benefits such as emotional well-being, or because a certain place confers social benefits such as the quality of life or economic value to the community. So a significant place is also understood here as a place which is dependent upon for some activity valuable to an individual. Another sense in which a sense of place is understood is in relation to place identity. Now, in this view, memories of place such as the neighbourhood one grew up in and had significant and shared experiences in, or the roots one has in a residence or neighbourhood and the people living there may provide an important feature of one's identity and territoriality. And finally, a sense of place is also framed as a person's emotional investment in it. On this view, significant places are a repository for emotions and relationships that give meaning and purpose to life. The common thread among these categorizations is that a caring for place is being framed as one's sense of place. That is, the significance of a place has a direct connection to the value that the place holds for a person or community. Overcoming this psychological barrier, then, requires drawing attention to how environmental crises threatens human well-being by articulating how environmental degradation will impact our sense of place as a thing which we deem valuable. In the wider context of understanding our moral responsibility in the face of environmental crisis, this is a normatively shallow ethical project and is a deeply anthropocentric one. I thought of framing it like this yesterday on the train ride home. I don't know if it'll be good. I think it might be frozen. Okay. So I think what's going on here is that the existing literature frames a connection to place which might motivate one's moral attention to it as arising from a sense of place. Instead, I want to propose that actually an authentic sense of place arises because one is connected to a place. It's completely the other way. So a parallel argument has been made against climate models. Humans have a responsibility to act right, and there are rituals associated with acting right that extend and articulate what a framework for responsibility and reciprocation looks like in diverse Indigenous contexts. Yet dominant scientific frameworks for climate models and simulations are the primary public modes of learning about environmental factors. Yet rarely, if ever, do scientific frameworks offer an adjudication of what humans could, should, or must do if there is an ongoing set of physical, cultural, and spiritual relationships between humans and non-humans and more than humans. The context of and for relations, as well as attendant responsibilities to maintain these relations, are not part of scientific frameworks. So, yeah, this psychological narrative, I think, is inaccurate. Our hypothesis is that the barrier to inaction that requires our attention is actually a deeply rooted, what I'm calling ecological estrangement. This disconnect it's a disconnection from the natural world. That's what I mean by it. This disconnect stems from our dominant ontology, morality, and epistemology, and this is a continuation here of Project One, that is recognising the depth of colonial heritage in 20th century environmental thinking. So, how do we counter ecological estrangement? With ecological empathy, I want to argue. But how can that be fostered? Well, first of all, we introduce what ecological empathy is as an intersubjective psychological state that is relatively stable but can be fostered or hindered by collective experience. Unlike moods or emotional states, which are transient, individual, and highly responsive to immediate context, we hold that ecological empathy is a more enduring state characterised by relatively stable patterns of collective values, attitudes, and beliefs about the natural environment. Second, we argue that ecological empathy is a crucial prerequisite of sustainable behaviours and attitudes motivating ethical choices made by individuals and organisations. And this empathy is, importantly, conducive to overcoming our sense of estrangement, whereby we instead feel a profound sense of shared responsibility, not just for the environment, but with the environment. Or another way of framing it is where we are of the world and not in the world. And I want to focus on this third point a bit. We propose that ecological empathy can be systematically fostered through immersive, embodied participation in collective practice designed to connect individuals and the natural world. So what do I mean here? Well, in Indigenous Australian Melanesian knowledges, how do ritual and ceremony embody, and I'm understanding that word embody here as sustaining the knowledge and fostering the expression of beliefs and attitudes conducive to a genuine moral attention towards the natural world. And I use Auntie Mary's term here, through moral memories of place. Moral memories of place blend together law and law with scientific and historical knowledges. Moral memories of place are, on this view, descriptions of the past or possible imaginings of the future. They are guiding principles for reality as both scientific and moral descriptions, and they are embedded within place. They underlie the delineation of totemic species, they define and exemplify kinship relation, and importantly, they describe when, where, and how to carry out ritual, such as those relating to ecological maintenance. So in Melanesian knowledges, this is called Rikwana, motivating the fulfillment of Gutpela Sindorn, which is the sort of spiritual achievement of shared responsibility and co-flourishing. It's achieved through the ritual of naming. And in Indigenous Australian knowledges, this fulfills the first law, and that is the relationship between people and land is the template for social relations. And just one of many examples is bushfire management. So courageous conversation number 2 would be, well, Indigenous Australian and Melanesian knowledges demonstrate how ecological empathy becomes more than a psychological attitude, either transient or stable, but instead becomes an outcome of a real, genuine connection to land. So philosophy and disciplines which ground their work in what we are as human beings and how we understand the relationship between the natural and social worlds, like I've argued here that this extends into the social sciences, can benefit from the rich understandings of being, doing and knowing found in Indigenous studies. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Yeah, thank you.
First of all, thanks, Oscar, for giving us an extra 2 minutes, because I know I'm going to need it with these two. No, on a serious note, a big thank you to Uncle Chegg and Auntie Charmaine, for giving us the welcome to country yesterday. It's a real blessing to be here. I personally feel very privileged. My birth country is Ipswich, and it's been the first time that I come back to my birth country since I was born. And so I feel a big connection in this place. Thank you very much for having me. I also want to acknowledge that this is Yagara and Turrbal country. I want to acknowledge that I grew up on Adyamatna, Bangala, Nukunu, Kugatha countries, Ghana country, but my people are Barkindji, and Afghan is the other aspect of my background. And I would like to also acknowledge that we come here today from Whadjuk Nyungar Boodjar, Whadjuk Nyungar country in Borloo, Perth. So thank you very much for having us, and I'll now pass to Uncle Max to give his acknowledgement as well.
Okay, thanks, Marleigh. How do we move the slides? Just this one? Yeah, thanks. Okay. Again, morning. Yeah. So usually I give welcomes because I live on my country, Whadjuk Nyungar Boodjar. Also, Balladong country is just outside of Nyungar Boodjar, it borders it. So I'll sort of speak in the old language because I ask the old people to look after, especially when we're carrying knowledge to come across and share with you guys. So kai nunakurt nalak kuling Whadjuk Nyungar Boodjar, nungan jurpan nunakurt nija Nyungara Gigi Durbal Boodjar Katajan, nungan anar nalang Morin Kichik Kiji Yingan Durban Nyungara Kiji Turrbal Boodjar Bangalanga Katajan. So hello everyone, we're coming from Nyungar country carrying knowledge to share with you, and we are always happy, and I'm always happy in my heart that everyone is here on this great place to share knowledge with you. I pay respects to all our elders past and present and emerging in, and I know that my old people would be very happy for sharing knowledge across coming this far, because my mum never left her place of where she lived. So thanks for that.
Hi everyone, my name is Fred Yasso. I'm actually from Bowen, Queensland. My mum is from Juri country, so Birigabba Nation. My dad's Yuma and Woolly from Central Queensland, but I'm the Director of Centre for Aboriginal Studies, so I find myself working over there. I'd like to acknowledge all the peoples that I've lived and worked on. So, of course, Juri country, where my mum are from, Jarwan country, where I grew up and did all my high school, Whadjuk country, spending since I was 22, and I'm now 50, almost 50 next year. And also actually have to acknowledge the Bindal and Walgarukupa people, who I worked on for 4 years as well too. So so that's all that acknowledge all those people. So I've been asked to talk about really is a positioning where what we're talking about here today. So as the Director of Centre for Aboriginal Studies, I've come along the Centre for Aboriginal Studies has been around since 1984. So we predate Curtin University. Curtin University started in 1986. The centre started in 1984, and it's been a Centre for Aboriginal Studies for many years. And our role, and it's really interesting to see, listening to everyone talk about where like Brendan was talking about how the four sort of areas, like the faculties, I think of them as faculties, and how often we sit within humanities. And the history of the Centre for Aboriginal Studies started in humanities, then we moved under the DVCA. We are now autonomously set outside of the faculties, so we actually have some autonomy, which is really great positioning. What we don't have is, unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to do the Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous critiquing, Indigenous knowledge critiquing, Indigenous studies in particular, because we spend most of our time teaching decolonisation of curriculum, right? So we work for the faculties, but we sit outside of them. So why we've come here to talk about this particular unit is because it's I'm going to change that. That's one of my first jobs as a director. That's why I'm really excited about coming out here and talking to all your mob. But this unit in particular is our unit that we talk about from a Nyungar perspective. So it's about local country, local knowledge, and it's a unit that we're really proud of. That which the two. Max and Marleigh can talk all about it, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that that's where we are positioning, and hopefully we're positioning to be in that space of, being capable of actually doing stuff like the Macquarie is doing. We'd love to have a centre where we have all these PhDs just studying and critiquing Indigenous knowledges. It's been a really great couple of days, so I'll hand it over to Max because you're next. Yeah.
No, I think Marleigh's next, though.
Marleigh.
Yeah.
I can talk about this if you want to. Yeah. So, look, this is what we do. We don't really use slideshows, We're pretty enough. We just give this to you to look at when you get sick of looking at us. So, look, we run this as an elective unit. This unit we call Nyungar Culture and Identity. We run this unit over an intensive 7 days, as it says here, and it's run during the mid-semester break. It's an elective unit, which we also think allows for students who are genuinely interested in this stuff to come into this space with us. What we do here is we really play between the third space, the first space, and of course the second space. But what we really do here is bring our concepts, and particularly Nyungar concepts, and ways of being and dreaming into this space to inform everything that we do. So we really... The absolutely integral, I suppose, piece to this is that we work in the relational space, which I think is not... I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here because this is what we do as Indigenous peoples, right? So it isn't just the physical space that we actually set out in this unit, which is the other integral piece to the transformation that we're talking about in this learning space, but we hold the social dynamic, which we will talk about a little bit more in the relational sense very soon. But where we see this transformation come in is where we frame looking at our unit and looking at Boorloo itself as being a major city in this country, and that is how it's viewed by non-Indigenous students. So we talk to them as being, this actually is country, right? You might see it as being once country and that there was a whole bunch of stuff here that's not here anymore, but it actually is still underneath all this concrete jungle that you guys walk on every day. So the part of that transformation is about them recognising that this is actually still country while it is a major city.
Yeah, and I think also with the students live there, so they have relatedness already to this place. So I have a lake that's down the road from me and it's Yellowgonga Lake, but they don't know who Yellowgonga was. So when I give them that information, then they actually then can pass on to the community that are part of those. So we sort of develop those kind of things for the students, but also we build on what they already have. And I think that's really important. International students are another big part of this, but also, this is why we create the cultural sort of, we bring the cultural dynamics into the actual teaching, because who are they missing? They're missing their family. What are we good at? We're good at embracing people and bringing them to be part of our family. So that those kind of actions actually develop a deeper learning, because they start to drop their barriers to learning at an earlier stage. We'll just go to the next one. So the complexities of our culture can create a lot of problems. So by utilising this kind of, creating this cultural setting, actually allows a lot of the complexity of our culture to sort of, because they see the visuals, they see it from not just sort of reading or taking things home and looking at the resources, but how we interact with each other. Marleigh's not from my country, Fred's not from my country, but they are my family. Everyone at that centre that works for me is my family. That is part of being Indigenous. You welcome someone onto your country. How do you look after them? You give them sort of roles that are actually family roles. My brother, my sister, Anthony, who it's such a pity he's not here because he is the person that really sort of developed this, sort of created that. And I stand back and I can see things and I could see what he was doing. But also the students developed this kind of relationship amongst each other. So at the end of the 7 days, they are leaving like their best friends because they've experienced what we do. They see it with us. So the complexities of the culture are actually developed in a way because they're actually getting it in multi sort of opportunities, I suppose.
And the other aspect to just this diagram, I suppose, is really about a visual of yarning for us. So we, these mob think we just go on and we start telling our stories, that we're diverting from the original conversation, but we understand that this is actually giving you another multifaceted layer to what we're talking about. So we use this representation of a spider web where we can start at the edge at that first point, and we might go straight for 2 or 3 layers, but then we can divert and we can go around the whole thing before we actually come back to that middle point. And it is about the interconnectedness between all of us as humans, but also the intraconnectedness and looking at the internal of where they not only get their biases from, but where they can pull their strengths from as well, and really utilise that in this space.
And I suppose we use those models, but we also use, we use those sort of teaching models, but also we use the actual physical models. And our Derbil Yurigan, our river, has so many options, and but they may go to the stadium. We've got a brand new stadium, but then we take them there, and actually Nick Abraham, my cousin, Uncle Nick, shows them all the cultural significance of that space. They will go to that stadium over and over, but going there with an actual knowledge of go and grab some sand and throw it in the water, those type of things really resonate. And along that river, like everyone's waterways, we have special areas. They are sacred areas. So for them to understand those type of things, we have an island which was used for women's business and those type of things. My grandmother was probably born on that area, because I have connections from, till time immemorial of sort of to this land. And Anthony he's really strong in this sense. And I was sort of having a business background. I was a little bit more sort of, with the academic rigour and attention to detail and timing, but he came along and relaxed me, I think, and he's really good for that. Do you want to add some more?
Yeah, actually on that, I get told do that all the time. Slow down, you're talking too fast. I do that when I'm nervous, so apologies, because I know I've been doing that today. Our elders tell us, Debakaran, slow down, go slowly. And this is also what we incorporate in what we do. We're not trying to rush their transformation. We don't expect them to transform in the next day or two, or even after the 1 week. We know that there are plenty of students after the 1 week that have that transformation, but transformation is, how long is a piece of string, right? So we allow the students to come into our space, and I guess the most important thing that we probably haven't mentioned yet is that we don't do this in a classroom. We only have part of our days in a classroom. We spend majority of the time out on country, learning in situ, as we have talked about today. Method of loci is integral for us as Aboriginal people to retain the information and the stories and the knowledge that we're talking about. And so we want to apply this in, the non-Indigenous sphere as well. So utilising, the Derbil Yurigan and the shape landscape, obviously, as we know, or I'm sure is very similar across our nation. The Waggle, as it's known here in Nyungar country, or Ngaji, as it's known in my own language from Barkindji country, the rainbow serpent, has made all of our waterways. And so we utilise Nyungar knitting or Nyungar dreaming and looking at this, and the central pillars of that being Boodjar country, Karajan knowledge, and Mort, which is family. Okay, and we also inform our practice and how we do this with our students by looking at Tyson Yunkaporta's pedagogy here and this 8 ways of learning framework. Learning in situ is one of the really big ways that we do this. However, we incorporate the differences of perspectives through all of our Centre for Aboriginal Studies staff members and our wider community elders in this space as well, which also informs those different modalities and different learnings that the students can get, knowing that we are not a homogenous peoples.
But the main thing is too, we don't forget our old people. We don't forget the Yalagongas, the Yagans, the Midjigaroos, and we utilise their histories as the foundation, and then we layer it into current days, such as the histories, the policies. The culture is the basis, and I do that with most of my studies, is learn the culture, then you understand the outcomes. It's no good sort of trying to teach someone about the 1905 Act if you don't understand what they were trying to stop. You know, our communication styles, our practices, reciprocity, you know, those type of things are significant. So the only way we sort of do that is actually we go back and talk about the old people first. We build it up to current day events, and that way when we talk about the 1905 Act, which is a barrier to these guys actually sort of developing their education, they are more open to it because they understand what was lost and why it was critical.
Yeah. And I think the important point about this as well is that we were a free settled colony in Western Australia, and it's known as the Swan River Colony at that point in time. And if you'll see here as well, it is, I told you, we got 5-minute warning, 25 words or less now, you fellas, come on. We're settled in the middle of winter, okay? So if we have a look at Nyungar knitting again and our seasonal cycles, we have 6 seasons in the Nyungar country, and they came in Makaru in the middle of winter. So our Nyungar people were moving away from the coast and they were moving back into the mountain ranges. And so this left the land for the colonisers, and we were under the impression that obviously you mob were going to leave, and they didn't. So when we come back again for these seasonal cycles, there was just more and more change. There was more change on the landscape. Obviously the fences had gone up, the houses had gone up, and this is where we get into the conflict. Just quickly to flick over these, because I know that this is probably quite similar to what a lot of us do. We really focus on LORE law versus LAW law because it's centred around our ways of being. So we look at our connection to country, we look at our obligations to our people, the reciprocity, the respect to country, the recognition of country, and the knowledge that it provides to us, and our ways of being through that interconnectivity and intraconnectivity. The relationships, again, are central to all that we do. It's relationships with us, as Uncle Max has mentioned, but it's also with our wider community, the elders, and we try and replicate this within the classroom.
I suppose, yeah, this is sort of the 1905 Act and just how the community sort of went apart, you know, and then came back together. So you guys are probably across this. This is just the way we sort of frame it to the students so they can see why we don't have this relationship anymore.
So just with this slide, like in particular, it's really important that students understand the systemic issues, right? We talk about systemic racism and systemic issues that segregated us. Most students don't know that. Most Australians don't know that. We can tell that from all the stuff that's going on with the Yes campaign, right? So most people don't understand their own history. So this talks about how things like the 1905 Act in WA, the Protection Act in 1901 here in Queensland, segregated both sides of community. And that did it forcefully. So that's why we don't know each other. So that's why things like reconciliation are hard, because we don't even have a relationship to reconcile, right? So we have those honest conversations and try to place them in a relation into privilege, right? So we also talk about the privilege people have in relation to students have, and they don't understand it. Privilege is not a bad thing. You have to recognise it. It's a good thing. So you have to recognise it, and how you position yourself, as we say. So this is a really important part of it about trying to build that thing, that sort of perspective. Yep.
So just in terms of visuals, I guess this really informs how we practice that, right? So we work in a way that is relational rather than transactional. Transactional, I suppose, has been demonstrated time and time again throughout the history, where we just focus on the outcome and what we can get out from each other, usually the dollars and cents, or more dollars, not much cents maybe. So we look at this sort of modality on the right-hand side, where we really work hard to create the synergy between all of those spaces. So that little tiny point in the middle, looking at the holistic sense of what we're doing, is really that interconnectedness, and bringing all of these aspects of our current staff, our students, our community all together, and working on those relationships and how they actually play out is one of the things that we do best. And it's really through this Nyungar family, which I won't touch on too much because Uncle actually did touch on it a little bit there. I think the important point here for us to mention, just due to time, is the fact that these locations are, again, critical being in the city, because this is the place that they live in, so they can continue to utilise their circle of influence to share the stories that we are telling them. So here are a couple of images of the places that we take them. As you can see, the first image on the top there is the Optus Stadium that Uncle Max mentioned earlier. We then have Yagan, who was an instrumental warrior, and we visit his burial place. Yagan has a really significant story, and so does his father, Midjuguru, who was the only man to be executed by a firing squad on Australian soil. That location is in Boorloo, Perth City, and we do take students around to these areas. We take them out to NAIDOC Week, because we run our unit mid-semester during that time, so students actually really get into the community and have a look at that strength-based approach that we do as Aboriginal peoples, and stop looking at us in that deficit model. We do talk about the history of that place. Uncle Max, you want to talk a little bit about this real quick?
Yeah, I suppose I'm privileged because I lived on a reserve. Now, I probably didn't think I was privileged then because we were poor and all these other things, walked to school with no shoes on. But they've still got the concrete pad, so I can show them how big that place was. I said to Anthony, we should get them to take their shoes off and actually try and walk the 1-2 kilometres that we used to walk. See how they went with that. But we thought, well, we didn't want to lose students. But we try and present these things which we talk about to actually give them real living examples. And at the end of it, we find the students really come together as a group themselves. And that's the beauty about it. That's why I thought we'd come and share it with everyone, and appreciate for everyone listening. This is just a few student testimonials. Thank you very much.